That block of Parmesan in your fridge? Chance it isn't cheese. That wasabi next to your sushi? 99 times out of 100, it's horseradish, mustard powder, and green dye. That bottle of extra virgin olive oil. Independent lab tests keep finding that most imported bottles don't even meet the standard for extra virgin. That jar of pure honey, it may have never touched a flower. We're not talking about junk food here. We're not talking about fast food or gas station snacks or anything you already side-eye. We're talking about the stuff labeled real, pure, and 100%. The stuff you trust because it looks boring and normal. So here's the thing. This isn't a video about calories or sugar or scary-sounding chemicals. It's about something a little creepier than that. Entire categories of food where what's on the label and what's actually in the package have almost nothing to do with each other. And in most cases, it's completely boringly legal. I went down a pretty deep rabbit hole for this one. Court documents, FDA filings, university lab reports, a decade of federal investigations. Every single example in this video ended up backed by an actual guilty plea, an actual lab test, or an actual government study, not a rumor, not a forwarded text from your aunt. And the same pattern kept showing up over and over. It's not that companies are hiding rat poison in your cereal. It's something almost sneakier than that. They're selling you the idea of a food, using the cheapest possible version of the real thing, and betting, and correctly, that almost nobody checks. The reason this is allowed to happen at this scale comes down to two words you've scrolled past 1,000 times on the back of a label and never once looked up. I'll get to those two words, but first let's start with the one that actually made it to federal court. For years, a company called Castle Cheese sold pre-grated 100% Parmesan to major grocery chains, Target among them, labeled exactly like that, 100%. Except when the FDA finally tested it, some of what they found contained no Parmesan at all. Instead, cheaper cheeses like Swiss, white cheddar, mozzarella, and Havarti bulked out with cellulose, a wood pulp filler normally used in tiny amounts to stop shredded cheese from clumping. Cellulose itself isn't the scandal. The FDA allows a small amount, usually capped around 4%, because otherwise shredded cheese turns into a solid brick in the bag. The scandal is the amount. Independent lab testing on grocery store Parmesan later found major brands sitting at 7, 8, even 10% cellulose, while the label still proudly said 100%. One dairy industry testing group found that only about a third of the grated Parmesan they checked actually matched what its label claimed. The company's president eventually pleaded guilty. Federal prosecutors said it outright. This was food built to look like the real thing, sold at the real thing's price for decades to some of the biggest retailers in the country. And the price gap tells the whole story on its own. A wedge of real, unadulterated Parmesan can cost roughly half as much per ounce as the pre-shredded tub sitting right next to it in the dairy aisle. You're not just getting less cheese, you're paying more for less, and Parmesan isn't even the most audacious one on this list. That neon green paste next to your sushi? Odds are extremely good you have never actually tasted wasabi in your life. Real wasabi is a fussy, slow-growing plant that needs cool running water and years of patience, which makes it one of the most expensive crops on earth to farm. So restaurants do the obvious thing. They use horseradish instead, a cousin plant that's cheap, fast, and produces a similar nose-clearing burn. Add mustard powder for extra kick, and a little green dye to sell the illusion, and you've got wasabi for a few dollars a pound instead of a few hundred. By most industry estimates, somewhere around 99% of the wasabi served in the United States is this horseradish blend. Not some of it, not just the cheap places. Basically all of it. Even in Japan, where the real plant actually grows, the estimate is still north of 90% fake. Here's the part that gets me. Nobody's really hiding this one. The entire condiment industry just quietly agreed that wasabi would mean the green, spicy paste, whether or not an actual wasabi plant was ever involved. The name survived, the plant didn't. Now let's talk about the bottle on your counter. You probably think is one of the safe choices. Extra virgin olive oil. Extra virgin isn't a vibe, it's a legal grade. The top tier, meaning the oil has no processing defects and passes strict taste and chemistry testing. So here's the uncomfortable part. When researchers ran blind lab and taste panel tests on the best-selling imported extra virgin olive oils in American supermarkets, the majority of them failed. Not extra virgin, but just okay. Failed the actual standard printed on the bottle. Some were oxidized, some were rancid, some had clearly been sitting around long past their prime before they ever reached a shelf. To be fair to the oil itself, failing that test doesn't usually mean it's some other liquid entirely. In most cases, it's still real olive oil. It just isn't the premium grade you paid premium grade prices for, which, if you think about it, might be the more insulting version of this story. You're not being poisoned. You're just being quietly overcharged for a rank you were never actually getting by companies who know that almost nobody owns a lab. Honey feels like the one food that should be impossible to fake. It's one ingredient. Bees make it. What is there to mess with? A lot, apparently. The trick is called ultrafiltration, running honey through filters so fine they strip out every trace of pollen. Legitimate producers do a light strain just to remove wax and bee parts. Ultrafiltration goes much further, and it does something very convenient for anyone trying to hide where their honey actually came from, because pollen is honey's only real fingerprint. No pollen, no way to trace it back to a country, a region, or a flower. Why would you want that? Because for years the US has placed steep tariffs on cheap honey from certain countries, partly to stop it from undercutting local beekeepers, and partly because some of it has turned up laced with banned antibiotics and heavy metals. So the workaround, nicknamed honey laundering, is to ship that honey through a third country, strip the pollen, relabel it, and sell it into the US as if it came from somewhere else entirely. Investigators eventually built a case involving tens of millions of dollars of honey moved this exact way before shipments were caught and importers convicted. And this isn't some rare contaminated batch. When one nationwide investigation bought honey off ordinary grocery shelves across more than a dozen states and tested it for pollen, the majority came back ultra-filtered, and at some types of stores, nearly all of it did. And here's the detail that still gets me. There is no official US legal definition of the word honey, none, which means the same gray area that let Parmesan get away with cellulose lets honey get away with almost anything, as long as nobody's technically caught lying on the label. If you want the single most tested category of food fraud in America, it's seafood, and the numbers are almost funny if they weren't so infuriating. One of the largest investigations ever done on this, testing over 1,000 samples nationwide, found that roughly 1 in 3 fish sold in the US wasn't what the label said. Red snapper had it worse than almost anything. Out of 120 samples bought under that name, only 7 were actually red snapper. Everything else was a different fish wearing a nicer name. White tuna wasn't much better. The overwhelming majority tested was actually a fish called Escola, which, fun fact, can cause some deeply unpleasant digestive consequences if you eat too much of it, and which most people have never knowingly chosen to order. Sushi counters were the worst offenders in the data. Restaurants came next, and actual grocery stores, with their barcodes and their scales, were the most honest of the three, which tells you something. The fancier and more anonymous the presentation, the easier it is to slide a cheaper fish under an expensive name and hope nobody at the table can taste the difference. And this isn't a problem that got solved. Years later, a follow-up investigation on seafood outside the main federal tracking program still found roughly 1 in 5 samples mislabeled, with sea bass and snapper once again at the top of the list. Same trick, same species, just a different decade. And speaking of fancy presentations, let's talk about the one that costs more per ounce than most of that fish combined: truffle oil. The stuff drizzled over the $22 fries at a restaurant that otherwise seems to know exactly what it's doing. Real truffles are a genuinely rare, seasonal fungus that can sell for thousands of dollars a pound, and their aroma is so fragile it starts degrading within days and can't survive being infused into oil through any normal process. So the honest version of truffle oil barely exists at scale. What you're actually tasting is a single lab-made compound called 2-carfordithiapentane, engineered to mimic one dominant note of a truffle's smell, dissolved into plain olive or sunflower oil. One peer-reviewed test of dozens of retail truffle oils sold across multiple countries found detectable truffle DNA in essentially none of them, and because there's no legal definition standing in the way, a bottle can be labeled truffle oil, truffle salt, or truffle butter while containing 0 actual truffle, as long as it delivers that one recognizable smell. At that point, you're not paying for a fungus at all. You're paying for a single, cheaply synthesized molecule wearing a very expensive name, and it's sitting on the table at restaurants that would never dream of serving fake Parmesan. Here's a phrase you've probably seen hundreds of times without giving it a second thought. Natural flavors. It sounds reassuring, fresh, simple, like someone squeezed an orange or crushed a handful of herbs into your food. But legally, natural doesn't describe how much of the flavor comes from nature, or even what it tastes like. It only describes where the original flavor compounds came from. A flavor can start with something natural, then go through extraction, purification, concentration, fermentation, and a long list of processing steps before it ever reaches your food. By the time it lands in a cereal, soda, yogurt, or protein bar, it may contain dozens of individual compounds working together to recreate a very specific taste. Yet on the label, all of that can be summarized with just 2 words: natural flavors. Companies argue that the exact recipes are trade secrets, just like the formula for a soft drink or a perfume. Regulators generally allow that, meaning manufacturers don't have to disclose the precise composition of these flavor blends to consumers. That doesn't automatically make natural flavors unsafe. In fact, many are thoroughly evaluated before they're used in food. But it does mean that consumers often know surprisingly little about one of the most common ingredients in the modern food supply. When you see natural flavors on a package, you're not really being told what you're eating. You're being told what the company doesn't have to explain. And once you notice that, you start seeing the same pattern everywhere. Not outright lies, but carefully written labels that reveal just enough to stay legal while hiding almost everything that actually matters. So why does this keep happening? If investigators, scientists, and regulators have been documenting food fraud for decades, why are grocery shelves still full of products that blur the line between what they are and what people think they're buying? The answer is surprisingly simple, because most of it isn't technically illegal. Food companies don't need to create perfect products. They need to create products that comply with the regulations where they're sold. If the law allows a grated cheese to contain anti-caking agents, manufacturers will use them. If truffle oil doesn't legally require real truffles, companies can sell the cheaper version. If a flavor blend qualifies as as natural, there's no obligation to reveal the entire recipe. And from a business perspective, the incentives are enormous. Replacing an expensive ingredient with a cheaper alternative, even by just a few percent, can save millions of dollars when you're producing food at a national scale. Those savings add up across thousands of stores and millions of packages. That doesn't mean every company is trying to deceive you. Many brands invest heavily in quality control, testing, and honest labeling. But the food industry is incredibly competitive, and when regulations leave room for interpretation, some manufacturers will always push right up to the legal boundary. That's why two products sitting side by side on the same shelf can look almost identical, carry nearly identical labels, and still be completely different in quality. The real lesson isn't that every food is fake. It's that marketing often tells a much simpler story than reality. The package shows a farmhouse, fresh ingredients, and words like artisan, premium, or natural. The ingredient list tells a much more complicated story if you take the time to read it. And once you start looking past the front of the package, you realize the biggest trick isn't what's inside the food, it's how the food is sold. So after all of this, should you stop buying Parmesan, olive oil, honey, sushi, or anything with natural flavors? Not at all. The point of this video isn't that every product is fake, or that the food industry is one giant conspiracy. The reality is much less dramatic, and in some ways much more important. Most food companies operate within the law. The problem is that the law often allows products to be marketed in ways that create a very different impression from what's actually inside the package. That's why becoming a smarter shopper isn't about memorizing every ingredient or avoiding every processed food. It's about knowing what to look for. If you're buying Parmesan, check whether the ingredient list starts with Parmigiano Reggiano, or whether it's mostly fillers and anti-caking agents. If you're buying olive oil, look for harvest dates, certified quality seals, and brands that are transparent about where the olives were grown and bottled. If you're buying honey, remember that local or single-origin honey with minimal processing is generally easier to trace than products with vague origins. When it comes to seafood, ask questions. Reputable fish markets and restaurants are usually happy to tell you exactly what species they're serving and where it came from. And perhaps the most important habit of all, ignore the front of the package for a moment. That's where marketing lives. Turn it around and read the ingredient list instead. That's where the product tells you what it actually is, because companies spend millions designing the front label to influence your emotions. They spend far less effort making the ingredient list exciting. The truth is, food fraud doesn't always look like counterfeit products or criminal schemes. More often, it hides in legal gray areas, carefully chosen words, and assumptions that most of us never think to question. Once you understand that, grocery shopping starts to look completely different, and that's exactly why the next food on your shopping list might not be what you think it is. The next time you walk through a grocery store, take a closer look, not at the bright colors, the health claims, or the pictures on the front of the package. Turn it over. Read the ingredients, read where it was made, read what the label actually says, not what the marketing wants you to believe. Because the biggest surprises in the food industry usually aren't hidden in secret factories or locked corporate vaults. They're sitting in plain sight on supermarket shelves, waiting for someone to read the fine print. If this video changed the way you look at food, share it with someone who does the grocery shopping in your family. There's a good chance they'll never look at the supermarket the same way again. And if you enjoy documentaries that uncover the stories behind the products we use every day, subscribe to Bite Republic. Every week we dig into the facts, the research, and the hidden side of the food industry, so you can make more informed choices without the hype. Until next time, thanks for watching.